As you hear these discussions today, some of you may be wondering how far away is some of what we're talking about. And as you've heard, some of it's happening right now. Some of you may be wondering when you can get a chance to walk around again because, you know, sitting is the new smoking. We're going to let you do that in a second. You know, it's really interesting how much data we're collecting about ourselves. And this next topic is something I'm really interested in. We have a tremendous opportunity to greatly improve how patients can take care of themselves by putting some of this data directly in their hands. With us today to talk about this is Gregory Stock. He's a best-selling author. He's a biophysicist, a professor, co-director of the Harris Center for Precision Wellness at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He's going to talk to us about the latest personal gadgets in development that measure all sorts of things about ourselves, our heart rate, our activity, our sleep, and how we use this to try and improve our own health. He believes that real-time monitoring and data feedback is going to be at the next generation of healthcare, although some of it's right now, and it could help us create the human beings of the future. So warmly welcome, Dr. Stock.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's such a nice environment to have a conversation of this sort. And I'm going to talk about two things today. One of them is going to be about the enormity of what is really occurring in the short time scale that that's happening in and the consequences that that's going to have for all of us, basically. And then secondly, I want to talk about what next generation healthcare is going to look like, because there are challenges associated with and there are some real advantages and benefits of this as well. And let's see. So there's been a lot of activity that we've been doing at the Center for Precision Wellness at Mount Sinai at the School of Medicine over the last couple of years. And right now, there's a creation of a new institute there for next generation healthcare. And Professor Joel Dudley, who's here in the audience, was able to come to this meeting, and he's going to be directing that, and it's really quite an undertaking that we're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So today, there are just extraordinary opportunities and possibilities that are available to us all. I mean, technology is making us do things that kings would have only dreamed of a few centuries ago, and yet, at the same time, the future, when you look towards it, especially as people get a little older, it feels very fragile, it feels uncertain, it feels challenging, sometimes a little bit alien. And that's because if you step back, the challenges ahead are really so huge. And what I want to talk about today is the way it's going to challenge the sense of who we are, of what we're doing, of our relationship with others, of purpose, all of these sorts of things. And what's happening is that we're at the heart of a transition that is without precedence in the history of life, in the 3.5 billion years of life. And what's occurring is that there are two revolutions. There's a Silicon Revolution that is going on, where we're really taking the inert world around us and beginning to breathe a level of complexity into it that rivals life itself. And that animating of the inanimate world means that nothing is ever going to be the same, where there will be no going back. And a child of that first revolution is the biotech revolution, which is equally consequential, and that's that life is beginning to get an understanding of its own workings at a fine enough level, at a precise enough level, that it's beginning to be able to manipulate that, to tweak it, to alter it, to adjust it, to take control of its future. And so we're in the midst of a very, very profound transition. And a new landscape is really emerging that is, the reason it's so challenging is that not only were we changing animals and plants throughout the world, but these technologies are going to turn back on ourselves. And we will be affected as well, things like genetic engineering and human genetic engineering. The idea of awareness in our devices, consciousness in machines, not just intelligence, but consciousness, and probably intelligence that's far beyond our own. And the combinations of human and machine, not just our prostheses, but the total of the close associations that we have with our devices that are becoming almost a part of us. So this is really what's occurring, and it's not particularly controversial if you step back a little bit and look at what this is leading us. There is going to be a world where basically all sorts of data is being captured all the time. We can guess what that means for privacy, where we have communications that's relatively continuous and anywhere we are with anyone we want to be in communication with, or any objects around us even, we keep track of our homes and such, that as more and more activity that humans are doing can be done faster, cheaper, easier by computers or devices of one sort or another. That means that huge labor displacements, which we can kind of deny is occurring, and we tend to do that. But I think that it's pretty clear there are going to be very massive labor displacements that we're having planetary-wide effects on the Earth. And in addition, that when you sort of think of where all these things lead, they lead to an abundance. But we have no mechanisms for distributing this abundance in a way that preserves dignity. We don't have those models yet, so you end up with huge wealth disparities. And this is blurring the boundaries that are very, very challenging for us. I mean, the idea that the difference between the born and the made, between what we construct, of what is natural or what we think of as natural and what is artificial. Biology is becoming more technology-like, and technology is becoming more biological and complex. And as I said, we're really linking to our devices in many, many ways. So where this is taking us is not clear at all. And anybody who pretends they know the shape of this in 50, 75, even 25 years is, I think they're guessing. And the real question is not if this is going to happen, it's how fast it's going to happen, and it's how dramatic the consequences are going to be for us, how quickly. And so the next frontier that we've sort of talked about with 2001: A Space Odyssey or these fantasies that we have, it's not out there. It's an inner journey into ourselves, understanding who we are and how we function and beginning to modify that. And so we're being really touched by technology. We're already living in a world that is essentially a fabricated world. It's completely unlike the world of our Pleistocene ancestors, that we're amplifying our senses in unbelievable ways from the very distant galaxies and such that we can see to the tiniest level with microscopes. We're changing our biology, perhaps not in the way that Hollywood envisions, but we're certainly very close to doing things that we care about, like extended human lifespan, perhaps, and how will we deal with that? And altering our minds and our emotions in various ways with cocktails of pharmaceuticals, very specifically and aware of what we do, or with stimulation of one sort or another, and changing our children or making choices about the genetics and the biological constitutions of our children. So these are the kinds of things that we are heading towards. And to get a feel for the consequences of what might be occurring, I want you to just step back and look at what we did to the gray wolf. With rather crude tools in a relatively short period of time, here are the offspring of the gray wolf. And now we're turning far more precise tools, because that was before we had genomic insights. That was before we had cheap, fast sequencing that was decreasing in price from $1 billion or more at a rate that's far more rapid than Moore's Law, to where it's really going, this information is going to be free soon, and it's just one of many aspects of the data that we're collecting. Before we could go in and do specific gene editing with something like CRISPR-Cas9. So this is really going to have an impact on our sense of who we are and why we're here, what we're doing, our values. And I think that it's important to look at what the moral implications are, the philosophical ones, the spiritual implications, and they're very, very difficult. And that's why I think so often people like to look at it that we're maybe running towards a cliff or something, because it's far harder to think about if we're not, where are we going to go? And so the discussion to date is basically coming through Hollywood, through science fiction writers, scientists who have pretty specific training that isn't necessarily philosophical, journalists, bioethicists. You notice this list. Well, where is the church? So that's my question that I pose, is why, when we get an acknowledgement from Pope Francis here about the Big Bang Theory, about evolution, why is this treated as such a big story? And it seems to me that often the church has been very far behind trying to resist changes or to not being in the vanguard of discussing and interacting about the very deep challenges that we're facing today. And I think we'll be talking about some of those in the panel that's to follow. So there are lots of things that are very, very, very challenging for us to reflect on. What's it going to be like to be human in an area where there's machine consciousness and awareness? What about how are we going to deal with dramatically extended lifespans? And there's a reasonable likelihood that that will occur. What's that going to have an impact on in our sense of self? Or with all of the divisions that are associated with new technologies that are emerging, particularly ones that involve human enhancement of one sort or another. And I think it's putting one's head in the sand to think that we won't be embracing these, because many, many people would welcome them. And then what lines should we be drawing, if any? And if we are going to draw lines, why should we be drawing them? So when you get changes of this sort coming in a short period of time, there's a lot of disruption that occurs. And I think that these changes are going to be driven by technology. They're going to be massive. There's no way we're going to avoid them. And what's interesting is that they're going to come as a surprise to many, many institutions and people, even though the signs are all around us if you stop and look at them. And so that's the challenges we're facing. But in dealing with these sorts of things, there are amazing opportunities as well. Anytime there's a sense of birth and a change, it's of course challenging because it brings new things to us. But I want to talk about one of these, which is the dawn of a healthcare that is very, very inspiring and that is far beyond anything that we have today and that is going to come fairly quickly. And it is based on all of the isolated kinds of advances that have occurred recently and have seemed dramatic, but individually they haven't really changed much because there's so much inertia. But together they are really going to transform medicine. And I thought it would be useful to talk about what a next generation of healthcare would look like, how it would feel. So first of all, it's going to be very proactive. It's going to be with us all the time, not just when we're sick, and it's going to be accessible. And by that, I mean anywhere you are, 24 hours a day, and everyone. And that seems like fantasy from the kinds of discussions we get about the challenges that are facing healthcare today. But I would like to show you that that's not really the case. Another thing is that we're going to be focusing on wellness, on vitality. And here are some older individuals that are doing things that are not usually the kinds of things that people are dealing with in their later years or that many of us could do today. Pulling fire trucks, doing these kinds of handstands, and sitting in the snow. And another aspect of a next generation healthcare is that it's actually going to be very knowledgeable. It's going to understand medicine in a way that no individual doctors or institutions can today, because it's integrating the masses of data that so many other speakers have talked about, and because not only because it knows medicine, but it knows us. It's built upon data that personalizes it for us. So it's going to be very worthy of our trust. I think we're going to have a relationship with us that is one like one of dependence, like we feel about a parent. And it's, as I said, it's going to be very individually tailored to us. So the question is, with something like this, and is that we're going to have very clear kind of communications to us that are not going to be necessarily data that we're going to want to receive. We're going to want to get information that is intuitive and that it comes at the right time. And an example of that would be what you can get on the watch there, which says, you know, you get a little click that says, you've been sitting too long, stand up and stretch. That's the kind of information that we want, and things that we can turn off when we don't want to get them. Or maybe that a more difficult thing to face is, you're about to have a heart attack, or you're heading towards that. An ambulance has been dispatched, or you need to get to an emergency room. Or that, your patterns have changed, you're really you're drifting into clinical depression. Call this number, or to call that person. Or just take a deep breath. You're really nervous. You're upset. Do you really want to have this conversation that you're about to have? Or, as you'll see with monitoring of sleep that I'll talk about in a moment, that maybe you need a little bit of rest. Why don't you turn off the TV or your screen? These are the kinds of things that would be nice to get, and it would be nice to get them in a way that's really useful to us and that we could turn off or adjust to the way we like to hear such messages. So what would it require to have a healthcare of that sort? Well, first of all, it would require very low marginal costs, meaning that it might cost a lot to build that system, but once you have that system, well, it's got to cost pennies to add new individuals. And that means it's very technology intensive, which it's natural that the only way you could have a system like that would be if that were the case, that it's going to be based on machine learning and the kind of deep data processing that many people have talked about here. And it's going to be much less reliant on physicians and much less reliant on hospitals, where there are all of the diagnostic apparatus that is available there. So, well, one of the things that you're going to need is clearly easy communication, so that you'll want a portal that you can carry around. We already have that, and in fact, it's going to obviously get much richer as we move forward. You're going to want communication that you can do anywhere, so you need a global network. Again, we already have that. It's going to get much richer. And you're going to want to do very deep data integration and analytics, which is on the way. There are lots of groups that are working on this. We certainly have a strong bioinformatics effort ourselves and are in the process of integrating all sorts of data. So that's going to move forward rather rapidly. When you do have to resort to a conversational interface, or when you're actually getting a verbal instruction, you'd want it to come in a way that's on your terms. And so you're going to want very natural language kind of interfaces. Watson has demonstrated some of that, so this is certainly on the way for doing this sort of stuff. And then a lot of data. And data not just about the populations as a whole, which is very interesting for generic advice that might or might not be useful, but data about ourselves. And we're beginning to be able to collect that with a variety of devices. And so I think that that's moving us towards an understanding of our biology, towards what we're exposed to, towards our genetics, towards the biology of our gut, towards our proteomics, all of these omics and other ways of collecting data, including a lot of devices that are both medical devices and commercial devices, consumer devices. You have to ask why we would have lots of monitors on a car just to keep it out of the shop, and yet collect virtually no data on ourselves until we're kind of breaking down in one way or another. And I think that that's going to move away, and the answer to that is because it's a pain to do these sorts of things. The devices don't exist, and it's difficult. Very soon, we're in the process of doing this sort of thing. We'll be putting together very rich data clouds that have information not only about all the kinds of omic data that I was talking about, but collections monitoring things like our mood, our cognitive functioning, the amount of exercise we're doing, the kind of exposures that we're getting to things that could be adjusted in our environment and that we may or may not know how they're affecting us. So all of these things, that's a lot of data. And the only way that we're going to be comfortable with that is if there are very, very strong privacy provisions around that, meaning that it's not going to be hackable and people can get into things that are very intimate. When you start collecting data about yourself, you realize how sensitive you are about these things, even if you tend not to be very sensitive or think you're not, like I am. So how comfortable are these sensors? So right now on the left there, you see an example of a sleep lab from maybe a decade ago. Then you start to move towards home monitoring with a fewer wires, and at least you can do it at home so that you can get a decent night's sleep perhaps. And this is Dr. Nora Zimmerman, who's working with us, doing a sleep examination at home, pretty natural sleep with a number of monitors there, including one beside the bed. And below, there's the little Oura ring that many of you have seen, which is a device that we thought would be interesting to look at because the form factor is nice, and it's something that you can see in a few years it's going to be even smaller, and then no doubt, like all of these technologies, it will be replaced by a little removable, either an implant or a little tattoo or something of that sort. So that the sort of very easy and convenient technologies of this sort are on the way. And when I talked about monitoring our cognitive state, our emotional state, well, the obvious thing is a bunch of tests, and you can do those either in long form, or we've been working on some rather short tests that you can take on your phone that are maybe a minute or something like that to get good cognitive measures that are correlated quite well with the longer tests. So, but if you're looking at these things, another way is just to look at your phone. When you're using a phone, you're depending on how you're typing in the keystrokes and the delays that occur, the metrics when you're talking on the phone, the changes in your behavior with email and phone calls, all of these tend to give clues as to not only your cognitive state, whether you're groggy, but your emotional state. So it will be rather easy to, in a very passive way, to monitor all of these sorts of things and provide feedback that will be helpful to us as individuals, again, if it's private and protected. So that's all on the way. So right now, I have a few devices on. I have an Apple Watch. I have an Oura Ring that we're using. I have a little vest on that's monitoring my breathing and my heart rate. It's a little hard to display these things directly here in the Vatican. And I'm doing a monitoring of my glucose. Every 5 minutes, I take a reading of my glucose level, so continuous glucose monitoring. Not very difficult to do this, although I have to occasionally change batteries. And Oura, as many of you have noticed, was being, Petri Latella, the CEO of Oura, is attending, and he has made complimentary rings available for all of you, and there are ways for you to claim those. This is all around the notion of making visible the invisible. All of the biomarkers and markers that are indicators of how we're functioning, of our state of wellness, of our health, of our emotional state, of the incipient disease, beginning to see these things in a way that's visible. And we don't want to look at a whole bunch of data on these sorts of things. Nobody's going to do that, except if you're really into the quantified self movement or very focused on these sort of things as a data jockey of some sort. But we've had a little, you may have noticed that lamp changing color. Well, this ring that I have on is connected, is playing through the phone here, and then that's broadcasting to a computer in the audience. It would be going to the web if we were outside the Vatican and there weren't such constraints. And then to that light, which is changing its color depending on my heart rate variability, as while we've been talking. So heart rate variability, the heart isn't a metronome with precise timing, boom, boom, boom. Instead, it's a very dynamic pattern that is based on regulation from your breathing, from your emotional state, from your activity, and a healthy heart has high heart rate variability, slight changes in the timing between beats as those different regulatory regimes kind of wash over one another. So that's an index of nervousness or of general health. The higher that is, the healthier it is, and you can do biofeedback to change those sorts of things. But it's just an example of transforming this into kind of a mood ring, and you can get information about something that might be important to you that is provided in a very convenient fashion and in a very easy fashion. So anything could be fed into something like that. So when is all this going to happen? It seems, as I said earlier, somewhat fantastical. I would say between now and a couple of years, depending on who you are and where you are, or maybe 20 years. Very, very soon. And that's a little bit shocking. And I say that because we're at the Institute of Next Generation Medicine. We're moving forward towards being able to create a capability to deliver this kind of thing in a context of wellness in particular. Lee Hood, Craig Venter, Eric Topol, names that many of you recognize, Patrick Soong-Shiong, a lot of people have their eye on this and are moving forward. So it's going to happen relatively soon. And what's interesting is that it's the concept that William Gibson had penned about the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And so I think you'll get a feel for that as you begin to wear a ring or start to look into some of these things. So here's an example of some of the things that are here right now. This was a paper in Science Translational Medicine. Dr. Dudley was the senior author, Dr. Lee was the lead author, and what they did was something very simple. Just take the electronic medical records at Mount Sinai, 11,000 of them that were in a particular category, and plot them out. Not very good data, incomplete often, and each point on that is a person that you can just see. And the color overlay, they're plotted by how similar they are in their medical records. And the color overlay, the red is for type 2 diabetes and blue is a complete lack thereof. So you see these little pockets of type 2 diabetes. Looking at data that is not very perfect, nothing like what I've been talking about, and it is in electronic medical records today, and not a huge amount of it. And you end up with 3 subtypes of type 2 diabetes, which hadn't been understood before, and probably different treatment, different outcomes. It would be useful to know which subtype you are and where you are on a plot of this sort. So that's something right here today. Another is if you translate that with type 2 diabetes into something that is an intervention that is before one has type 2 diabetes, so with prediabetes, for example, then we're all very, very individualized. We're individuals. And this is a paper out of Israel by Professor Zivi. And what's plotted there is on the x-axis, it's exposure carbohydrates, a meal and how much carbohydrates there is. And on the y-axis there is what the postprandial, the after meal glucose jump is. And what you can see is that it's not this meal is bad for you or you're going to have this response because of the qualities of the meal, although very low carb will tend not to give you a glucose response. There's all sorts of individual variation. So you have to look at how the individual responds. And I happen to have taken that a little bit further personally because I came up with, I was looking at my hemoglobin A1C level on an annual checkup, and it was drifting up towards prediabetes. And I have no history of diabetes in my family, and I was thought I ate pretty well, and we have all these devices, and so I began to look at my glucose, not just taking a little finger prick, but actually monitoring it and seeing what happened. And it was quite interesting in that what was occurring is with the kinds of, before doing this kinds of monitoring, if I looked at my diet with something like this, a lot of fruits and vegetables, kind of grazing, not paying much attention to it, occasional bagel, but tend to be pretty low fat. Some stir fries here, some sushi, probably not too different from what many of you would eat. And when I started looking at my glucose level, that line in yellow there is 150. So I'm really pushing up to fairly higher levels, not diabetic yet, but from just eating an apple or eating some non-fat yogurt or particular anything that's a roll or something. So I was, over a period of 25 years, was just kind of bouncing my glucose around because I tend to graze a lot and such. And as a result, I changed my diet rather dramatically. And it's been very, very challenging for me in that now I have to eat things like the heavy cream on raspberries, or I'll eat, triple sec cheeses that I'm sure would be, here's a steak au poivre, and lots of nuts, some dark chocolates, all interwoven with the things that I would normally eat but would be in much lesser quantities. And you can see it's just flat. So I can control my glucose in a very easy way now without any great change in my diet other than substituting Haagen-Dazs for a frozen yogurt or something very difficult like that. And it's interesting, I simply could not have done that without very close personal monitoring, which is, I'm surprised, but I actually really enjoy that now because I can kind of watch those sorts of changes going on, and very little deep analysis that's going on with that. So I think that I wanted to discuss next generation medicine and these larger issues as a lead-in to a broader discussion of what the implications of all of this are for us. And I think that Thucydides could have been speaking to us when he spoke 2,500 years ago, and he said the bravest are those with the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding, go out and meet it. And I think that is the position that we are in today as to whether we will look at what is really happening and think about how we can deal with it in a way that serves us. Thank you very much.